My son Robin was handed this by an aggressive street preacher this past week. The preacher frequently stands in front of the crosswalk signal at a busy intersection on the Auburn campus, where anyone wanting to push the button for a walk signal must approach him. Let's analyze the apologetics. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. I will say one thing for Chick Trucks, at least they have pictures. Whoever made this gospel message clearly knew nothing about marketing. They did use an intriguing opener, "What shall we escape?" But that's the best part of the entire thing. It's all downhill from here. Starting with the lack of white spaces, no paragraphs, no clear organization, no supporting documentation, and so on. Okay, beyond this being a visual nightmare, let's see if this has any intellectual or emotional appeal. Susie was visiting a young lady, Sarah, because she needed some help. Who is Susie? Where are we? When are we? Susie owned and run a cafe. I don't think English is the author's first language. Either that or the author didn't proofread this. When a man died in the community from poison, the chef Brad wanted to blame Sarah because he raped Sarah when they were in high school and he got away with it. Is that supposed to be chef or sheriff? This is a cafe. Does the chef think that Sarah is poisoning the customers? Or does the sheriff have reason to suspect Sarah? Either way, it looks like we've confirmed our author is not a native English speaker. Again, either that or a really bad speller and proofreader. Since it's unlikely that Sarah would hire the man who raped her to be a chef at her cafe, it probably means sheriff. But this makes no sense. Why would the sheriff want to blame his victim because of a past crime that he got away with? If anything, he should want to steer clear of Sarah. She hasn't told anyone for at least a couple of years. Why does he think she's going to speak up now? He always wanted to have sex with Sarah, but she avoided it again. What does that even mean? If he raped her, she wasn't able to avoid him. He's been after her for sex ever since, and she keeps avoiding him now? Likely. We'll go with this one. So Brad wants to pin a murder on Sarah that she didn't commit because she won't have sex with him. Well, duh! What do you expect her to say? You raped me when we were in high school, but that's all behind us now. Let's get together. Rape is about power, not sex. Brad doesn't want Sarah because he loves her or finds her attractive. He wants her because he wants to dominate her. Well, newsflash, Brad. Not all women are into that. Go find someone who is. The poison was cyanide. Chef Brad went to Sarah Cafe and searched for cyanide. Is Sarah Cafe the name of the cafe, like this or like this? Maybe this is an escape place for women. Dear, I'm going to Sarah. Sarah probably serves liquor, too. It's a place for women to hang out and get drunk while their husbands think they're out visiting a friend. And why is the sheriff conducting a search without a warrant? He does realize that anything he finds will be inadmissible in court, doesn't he? Sarah had some rat poison that contained some cyanide in it. Likely her and the rest of all the other business owners in town. And how much cyanide? Enough to kill a man? Does he think Sarah put poison in the man's food when he was a customer? Brad is the chef, after all. Maybe he put in the poison. I'm wondering if whoever wrote this had a hard time keeping the story straight and was never really sure whether Brad was the chef or the sheriff. Maybe it's a really small town and he's both. So the chef arrested Sarah, and her lawyer, Bill, had her released, for the evidence against her was weak. What evidence? The rat poison that Brad found can't be used as evidence. The community had made up their minds that she was guilty because she had been accused of killing someone, but she was found not guilty. Whoever wrote this doesn't understand the criminal justice system here either. If the charges were thrown out, then there was no trial. She would not be found not guilty because there was no trial. If she was released pending trial, she could have a low bail because of weak evidence. but she wouldn't just be released pending trial for murder with no bail. But also, a sheriff acting alone can't charge someone with a felony. He needs to go to the grand jury for an indictment. If this is supposed to be referring to a grand jury proceeding, a grand jury does not make a finding of guilty or not guilty. They return a verdict of true bill or no bill. Okay, it's just a story. We'll pretend the author got the facts right, like I do when I watch court on TV and they get the procedure wrong. Susie started investigating. At the beginning of the story, Susie was visiting Sarah. I'm guessing Sarah told her story to Susie and Susie is investigating. Is Susie a detective? Does she have any skills in this area? She found out that a local company had used cyanide-contained chemicals in the past, and an earthquake had occurred recently. Cyanide-contained chemicals? That is incoherent. A chemical compound can contain cyanide, but how does cyanide contain other chemicals? Cyanide is a chemical. It's a fast-acting poison that can be lethal. Cyanide was used as a chemical weapon for the first time in World War I. Low levels of cyanide are found in nature and in products that we commonly eat and use. Cyanides can be produced by certain bacteria, fungi, and algae. Cyanides are also found in cigarette smoke, in vehicle exhaust, and in foods such as spinach, bamboo shoots, almonds, lima beans, fruit pits, and tapioca. The chef could also have found cyanide just by opening a peach and finding a pit in it in the cafe. And why does Susie need to investigate to find out there was an earthquake recently? Was it so small that no one noticed? Sarah was being harassed daily, and Ralph, a womanizer, was at Sarah's house drinking red wine, and he tried to attack Sarah, and he wanted to have sex with her, but Susie came downstairs and stopped Ralph. Why did Sarah let Ralph in when he was harassing her daily? Why would she serve him wine? And why was the wine red wine? Does that make a difference? I'm guessing at this point that this is all going to be an allegory, and if so, it looks like Susie is God the Father, Sarah is Jesus, and Brad is all the sinners in the world. Sarah served red wine to Ralph to symbolize her blood being shed for him, but Ralph is the one that ends up dead, not Sarah, and Brad is the Judas of the story. If this is an allegory, it's sure not going to work. Ralph was married to a lovely nurse, Nancy, and it didn't make any senses that he was such a womanizer. Okay, if it wasn't clear before, it is now that whoever wrote this is a man, and that man thinks that if a woman is pretty, that's all a man needs in a mate. Maybe Nancy and Ralph are incompatible sexually. Maybe Nancy, for whatever reason, can't or doesn't want sex. Maybe they have an open marriage. Maybe Ralph is just a jerk. This is the most likely option since he's after Sarah, who clearly doesn't want him. I also really get the impression that this was written by a Muslim man, with all the emphasis on men being unable to control themselves around beautiful women. Then I think someone tried to Christianize it by omitting any references to how the women dress. Also, at the beginning, Susie was visiting Sarah. Why is Susie upstairs at Sarah's house when the murder allegedly happened? Evidently, Susie was there on the night in question. Kind of disqualifies her as an investigator. And why was Chef Brad looking for cyanide at the cafe if the murder is supposed to have taken place at Sarah's house? But a little after Ralph had come home, he fell dead, and it was from cyanide poison. How does anyone know that Ralph was even at Sarah's house? The police have no reason to go to Sarah's and ask, unless Nancy told the police that he had been there. If Ralph told Nancy, and Nancy told the police this gives Nancy a motive to kill Ralph when she found out that he was after Sarah. Certainly at least as much motive as Sarah had. And when does the earthquake happen? How does that fit in? The chef arrested Sarah. Why are we repeating this part? We already dealt with the lack of evidence against Sarah, not to mention that he's got no arrest warrant. There are exceptions for the need for an arrest warrant, but none that apply here. Susie found out where the company that had used cyanide-contained chemicals was located, and she notified a group that searched for chemical contamination, and the group started digging to search for the chemicals that were responsible for the contamination. If there was a chemical contamination in the area due to an earthquake, Ralph should not be the only one affected. It's possible that he could be the only death, especially if he had underlying conditions that predispose him to cyanide poisoning, or if he had much greater exposure than most other people. But even with one or both of these, if there was cyanide poisoning in the area, there should be a lot of people sickened by the spill, not just one single death. This story is really sus. They were searching vigorously, and the chef wanted to stop them, but the group found a concrete vault full of chemicals, and the earthquake had ruptured the vault, and the cyanide containing chemical had leaked in their water on the south side of town where both men had died from cyanide poison. Both men? There were two? At the start of the story, you said a man died of cyanide poisoning. Now it's two men, Ralph and evidently another man. What was Sarah's motive for wanting the other man dead? If the cyanide is in the water, why are only the men being poisoned? I would expect it to affect the children first. Also, the fact that the chef is trying to stop the group from finding the chemicals sure makes it look like Chef already knows about the chemical leak. What else is Chef hiding? But Susie said that there was one of the men that died due to poison from another source. Susie proved that Nancy poisoned her husband. Ah, so I was right about Nancy. So why did anyone even suspect Sarah? When there was already an issue of poisoned water and one other death, why not think it was the water? This story makes no sense. So Sarah was released from jail. Wait a minute. Before you said she was released when Bill, her lawyer, showed that there was no evidence against her. Did Sarah get arrested again? And now she was accepted by the community and she started dating Bill. I don't think the author of this story is able to keep his own storyline intact. Before, Sarah wasn't accepted even though she was found not guilty. Now she's released without a trial and is accepted and is dating the lawyer that helped facilitate her release in one version of the story, but not the other. Wait a minute. Is this the foundation for a couple of new gospels? We got a couple of contradictory points here. Is this going to be the Gospel of Sarah according to Bill and the Gospel of Sarah according to Susie? Now, the kingdom of heaven is like a very large net. It moves through the sea of life, drawing men almost without them knowing it, to eternity, and by the time they awaken to what is happening, it is too late. Finally, we are getting to what all this has to do with God. But how does this statement even relate to the story? There's no indication that Sarah was swept into this without knowing what was going on. Maybe Chef Brad? No, that doesn't fit. He was well aware that he was framing Sarah. Also, if God is catching people and they don't even know it until it's too late, that would make God the bad guy in the story. Maybe this is supposed to be a more accurate evangelism. Don't get caught believing in God, or he'll take you to what he calls heaven, but it's really a bad place. Christ shall send his angels, and they'll gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them who do iniquity, and they shall be cast into the furnace of fire, where there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So everyone is going to heaven, but the angels will weed out the offensive ones to be thrown into the furnace. Who decides which ones are the offensive ones, and on what grounds? And how offensive? Picking their teeth in public offensive, or murdering offensive? While the kingdom may, for a while, tolerate good and evil growing together, the separation is moving closer and closer all the time to Christ's judgment. Is this like a Half-Life thing? We keep getting closer, but each step is half the size of the last one, so we never quite get there? I mean, y'all been predicting this coming any day now for the last 2,000 years. At what point do you finally give up and go home? On his right hand, he says, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Is this a tattoo? Is it written on his hand? Or is this a talk to the hand kind of thing? And again, what does this have to do with the story? He'll say to them on the left hand, "Depart from me and be cursed into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Were these scooped up into the net and dropped into his hand? Are they on his hand or in his hand? And again, what does this have to do with the story? If Jesus hadn't taught us about hell, we wouldn't believe it. I don't know if Jesus taught about hell or not, but I don't believe it. So it doesn't appear to matter if Jesus taught about it or not. It had to be from him. It is so inconceivable. Interesting. You admit that it's inconceivable that a loving God would send people to hell. especially ones that just got scooped up in a net and had no idea where they were going. But once again, what does this have to do with the effing story? Every idle word that men shall speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you shalt be justified, and by your word you shalt be damned or condemned. Smite them, I say, for their words be offensive to my virgin ears. Yeah, just like in the story when Brad was convicted for his crafty attempt to get the innocent Sarah condemned. Wait, no, that didn't happen. Oh, I know. Like when Ralph got killed for committing adultery. Wait, no, he never did commit adultery. Sarah refused him. Like when Nancy was convicted and condemned for murdering her husband that she thought was cheating on her, but really he just had some wine at Sarah's. Wait, no, that didn't happen either. It says Susie proved that Nancy killed her husband, but it doesn't say what happened to Nancy. So, how does any of this relate to the story? Our generation says so little about hell because it's so hard to believe. It's so terrifying. It's only terrifying if you actually think it's real. Not being real, it's no more terrifying than any other horror movie. It's a place of fire. Fire is God's way of describing it as a kind of fire more terrible than any fire that we would ever know. Did you even read that sentence to yourself? Fire is a way of describing it as a kind of fire. Well, no, duh. I certainly didn't expect that fire was a way of describing as a kind of freezer now, did I? Well, hell is a place of unrelieved torment and horrible misery and impenetrable darkness, without the hope of light forever. So, why did God make it in the first place if it's so bad? Because he needed a place to keep the devil and his angels? How about just don't make the devil and his angels? Now you don't need a place to contain them. And once again, what the hell does this have to do with the story? Was there ever a point to the story? He changes gears now and tells another story. If there was a point to the first one, he never got to it. A preacher was addressing a group, and he said, "If you want to go to heaven, raise your hands." The preacher noticed a young boy on the front row didn't raise his hand. So after the session was over, he approached the boy and asked him why he didn't raise his hand. "Let me guess," he said, "because all my friends are going to hell. Is that it? Or, why would I want to be with a God that would make a place like hell? Is that it?" The boy said that he eventually wanted to go to heaven, but now he would wait because he was having too much fun. What about you? Then it says John MacArthur. Since there are no paragraphs, it looks like it's trying to say that John MacArthur wrote all of this. Now, I have no respect for John MacArthur. He's the swine that forced a woman to flee with her children to escape her husband, who admitted to trying to murder one of her children and was convicted of sexually abusing them as well. To this day, MacArthur defends that pedophile. If you want more on that story, see the Royce report linked in the description. But MacArthur can write better than this. I've read some of MacArthur's writing, and it is better. Clearly, MacArthur is not the author, nor is this story about him. He says that he was always a believer. The point of this video is, while this is about the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, this is street evangelism. Most of us will never meet Ray Comfort on the street, but many of us will encounter someone like this that blocks the crosswalk and wants you to take his ridiculous, illogical literature that most people will just throw in the trash without ever looking at. The guy probably thinks that he's doing some kind of service to humanity, warning people of the wrath of a God that they can escape. But is he? He's not reaching anyone. Even when you read his material, it's incoherent. If this is really the most important thing in all of eternity, why would an omniscient God depend on this to spread his message? If there really is an omnipotent God that wanted to send a message to humanity, not only should this God be able to do better than this, the God should be able to do better for this street preacher. Think about it. The poor guy is out there day after day in an exercise of futility, facing insult and humiliation daily because he's so bad at what he does. Was his God not able to find him something that he could do well? Like maybe put food on shelves at a food pantry. If God could turn water into wine and walk on water, could he not miraculously change this guy's literature to something into a coherent argument that's effective? Finally, borrowing a comment from a viewer, if the preacher was right and the house is on fire, and I'm doing laundry completely oblivious, would a loving God come and tell me himself? Or leave an incoherent note on the table on his way out the door? Live your life.